The first killing frost came to the Bitterroot Valley on September 22nd, 2 weeks earlier than anyone expected. It crept down from the Sapphire Mountains like a thief, silver and silent, turning the last of the summer gardens to black mush by morning. All across the valley, families woke to the smell of frozen tomatoes, and the sight of squash vines collapsed like wet rags across their rows. Clara Mendsen stood in what remained her garden patch, her breath making clouds in the cold air, and felt nothing at all. Not surprise, not grief, not even a mild disappointment that would have been appropriate for the occasion. Just a familiar numbness that had settled into her bones 3 years ago when they lowered Daniel into ground and hadn't lifted since. Her dog, a border collie mix named Frost, named for the white blaze across his black face, not for mornings like this, pressed his shoulder against her leg. He always knew when she went too quiet for too long, when the silence inside her got louder than the world outside. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. The garden had never been much. Clara wasn't a natural gardener. Didn't have her mother's instinct for knowing when to plant or her grandmother's patience for the endless weeding and watering that kept things alive through the long Montana summers. She had kept it going out of obligation more than love, because it was what people did, because the house had always had a garden, and stopping felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit, that she was alone now, that the routine she and Daniel had built together meant nothing when only one person was left to perform them. The tomato plants looked obscene in their death, blackened fruit still clinging to vines that had been green and vigorous just yesterday. She should cut them down, clear the plot, prepare the soil for spring. That's what her neighbors would do. That's what the extension agent's pamphlets recommended. Clean up, turn under, start fresh when the ground thawed. But Clara didn't move. She just stood there with frost warmth against her leg and the cold seeping through her jacket, and wondered when she had stopped caring about any of it. The house behind her was quiet. Too quiet. It had been Daniel's grandfather's place originally, built in 1947, when the valley still believed in the promise of small-scale agriculture, when a man with 40 acres and a willingness to work could carve out something resembling prosperity. The house was solid, log construction with a metal roof that rang like a bell when rain fell, but it felt empty now in a way it never had when Daniel was alive. Empty in a way that had nothing to do with the physical space and everything to do with the silence that filled it. She had tried to leave. Twice. Once right after the funeral, when her sister Missoula offered her a room and a job managing the books at her husband's hardware store. Once 6 months later, when a friend from college called to say there was an opening at the university library, benefits and everything, a real chance to start over somewhere that didn't smell like grief and diesel fuel and the particular loneliness of rural Montana. Both times, she had packed boxes. Both times, she had stood in the driveway with Frost beside her and the truck loaded, and both times she had unpacked everything and stayed. Not because she loved it here, not because the valley felt like home in any way that mattered, but because leaving felt like betraying something. The life she and Daniel had planned. The future they had sketched out together during long winter nights when the wind howled down from the peaks and the wood stove crackled and everything seemed possible. That future was gone now, but she didn't know how to build a different one. The town had opinions about her staying. Of course they did. Small towns always had opinions, especially about women who didn't follow the expected script. They thought she should sell the place. 40 acres was worth something, even if half of it was rock and sage, and move somewhere sensible. Somewhere with other people her age, with opportunities, with a future that didn't involve slowly fossilizing in a house built for a family she would never have. They didn't say it to her face. Not exactly. But she heard in the way conversations shifted when she walked into the feed store, in the too careful sympathy that edged every interaction, in the suggestions that always came wrapped in concern but felt like judgment. You're still young, Clara. You could start over. Daniel wouldn't want you wasting away out here. There's nothing for you in this valley except memories. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. And Clara had stopped trying to explain the difference. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early October, forwarded from an attorney's office in Spokane that Clara had never heard of. It came in a cream-colored envelope, the kind that suggested either wedding invitations or bad news, with her name written in fountain pen across the front. Elegant handwriting that belonged to a different era, when people took time with such things. Frost watched from his spot by the wood stove as she turned the envelope over in her hands. He had learned, over 3 years of watching her, to gauge her moods by small signs, the tension in her shoulders, the way she held her breath. He stood now, ready to offer comfort if she needed it, his dark eyes tracking her movements. She almost didn't open it, almost threw it in the stove with the morning's kindling, and let whatever it contained turn to ash unread. But something stopped her. Curiosity, maybe, or just the smallest flicker of something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't quite resignation either. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The letter was brief. Dear Mrs. Mendsen, I represent the estate of Ingrid Halvorsen, late of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Mrs. Halvorsen passed away on August 15th of this year, at the age of 94. In her will, she left specific instructions regarding a property and certain items to be transferred to you upon her death. According to her records, you are the granddaughter of her sister Astrid Halvorsen Lindquist, making you Mrs. Halvorsen's great-niece. The property in question is a 2.3-acre parcel located in the Bitterroot Valley, Montana, approximately 4 miles from your current residence. Enclosed, please find a photograph of the structure on the property, along with a key. Mrs. Halvorsen's instructions specify that you are to receive both the land and the structure as is, with a request that you read the accompanying materials before making any decisions about its disposition. Additional documents will be sent under separate cover. Please contact this office at your earliest convenience to complete the transfer paperwork. Sincerely, Robert Chun, ESQ. Clara read it twice, trying to make sense of words that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. She had never heard of Ingrid Halvorsen. Her grandmother Astrid had died when Clara was 12, and family history had never been something her parents dwelled on. There had been sisters, she knew that much. Women who had scattered across the West in the way families did in the early 20th century, losing touch across distance and time and the simple erosion of everyday life. But a great-aunt she had never met. Leaving her property? It felt like something from a novel. The kind of convenient inheritance that solved problems too neatly to be real. She picked up the photograph. It showed a structure unlike anything Clara had seen before. At first glance, it looked like a greenhouse. She could see glass panels, a metal frame, the unmistakable shape of something built to capture light. But the proportions were wrong. Instead of the peaked roof typical of greenhouses, this one sloped downward from both sides, meeting in a central valley that ran the length of the structure, like the roof on a Norwegian widow's cabin. Clara thought suddenly, remembering a story her grandmother had told once, about a woman who built a roof that collected rain instead of shedding it, and how everyone said she was crazy until their roofs leaked, and hers never did. This greenhouse had the same inverted design. 2 planes of glass sloping inward toward a central trough. But there was more to it than that. The photograph showed the structure partially buried, its northern wall set into what looked like an earthen berm. The southern exposure was entirely glass, but the angle was steep, nearly vertical at the base, then gradually sloping back as it rose. It looked wrong, unnatural, like someone had taken a conventional greenhouse and turned it inside out. In the bottom margin of the photograph, someone had written in the same elegant handwriting from the envelope, built in 1952. Still produces. Trust the design. Clara turned the photograph over. On the back, in different ink, as if added years later, they laughed at me, but the land knows what it needs. You'll understand when you see it. Come in winter, that's when it proves itself. Aunt Ingrid, Frost whined softly. He could sense the shift in her, the way something was stirring beneath the numbness, something that felt almost like curiosity, almost like purpose. She looked at the address typed at the bottom of the attorney's letter, for miles from her current residence. That would put it up near the base of the Sapphires, where the valley narrowed and the elevation started climbing toward the peaks. Rocky ground up there, short growing season, the kind of place where even experienced farmers struggled to coax anything useful from the soil. And someone had built a greenhouse there, an upside-down greenhouse that, according to a woman who had been dead for 2 months, still produced. Clara folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope along with the photograph. She should call the attorney. She should ask questions. She should probably refuse the whole thing. What did she need with a strange greenhouse on a piece of land she'd never seen, left to her by a relative she'd never met? But instead, she reached for her truck keys. Frost was already at the door, tail wagging slowly, knowing before she did that they were going somewhere, that something had changed, that the woman who had been standing still for 3 years was finally ready to move. The road climbed steadily from her property, winding through sage flats and scattered pines, past ranches that got smaller and rockier the higher you went. Clara knew this country, had driven these roads with Daniel 100 times, heading up to fish the high lakes or scout elk before hunting season. But she had never paid attention to individual parcels, never looked for driveways or structures that might indicate habitation. The address led her to a turnoff she had passed countless times without noticing, a dirt track barely wide enough for a truck, marked by a rusted mailbox with no name, just numbers painted in faded white. She turned carefully, feeling the truck's suspension protest as the wheels found ruts worn deep by decades of use. The track climbed for a quarter mile through Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, the trees closing in on both sides, their branches scraping against the truck's paint. Then the forest opened abruptly into a clearing that took Clara's breath away. The greenhouse sat at the base of a granite outcropping, positioned where the mountain's shoulder created a natural windbreak, and the southern exposure opened onto a view that stretched for miles across the valley below. Even from a distance, Clara could see how the structure had been integrated into the landscape. The northern wall literally built into the earth berm, the glass panels catching the afternoon sun, the inverted roof creating that strange valley she had seen in the photograph. But the photograph hadn't prepared her for the scale of it, or the way it seemed to grow from the land itself rather than sitting on top of it. She parked and got out slowly, Frost jumping down beside her. The air was colder up here, thin and sharp with the smell of pine resin and approaching snow. The clearing was larger than she had expected, maybe an acre, with the greenhouse occupying the southern portion, and the rest given over to what looked like garden beds, most of them empty now with frost-blackened plants collapsed across the soil. But as Clara walked closer, she noticed something odd. Some of the beds weren't empty. In a section nearest the greenhouse, protected by what looked like cold frames made from old windows, there were plants. Green plants. Growing plants. Things that should have been killed by the frost 2 weeks ago, but were somehow still alive. Lettuce, she realized, and kale. Some kind of Asian green she didn't recognize. All of them thriving in conditions that had turned her valley garden to black mush. Frost pressed close to her leg as they approached the greenhouse itself. The structure was larger than it seemed in the photograph, perhaps 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, with a door on the eastern end and windows that could be opened along both sloped glass walls. The key from the attorney's envelope was in Clara's pocket. She pulled it out, her hands trembling slightly, though whether from cold or anticipation she couldn't say. The lock was old but well-maintained, turning smoothly when she inserted the key. The door swung inward on oiled hinges, and warmth hit her like a wall. Warmth, in October, with no visible heat source. Clara stepped inside and understood immediately why the town would have mocked this design. Why anyone seeing it for the first time would have called Ingrid Halvorsen crazy. Because everything about it was wrong, inverted, opposite to every principle of greenhouse design that Clara knew from extension pamphlets and gardening books. The roof sloped inward, just like in a photograph, with a central valley forming a gutter that ran the length of the structure. But standing inside, Clara could see what the photograph hadn't shown, the thermal mass. The northern wall wasn't just earth-bermed. It was lined with stones, hundreds of them, dark granite that had been carefully stacked and mortared, creating a wall that must have been 18 inches thick. The floor wasn't gravel or concrete, like most greenhouses. It was stone as well, flat rocks fitted together with sand between them, dark surfaces that were warm to the touch even though the sun was already sinking toward the western peaks. And along the central valley where the two glass plains met, instead of a simple gutter, there was a channel lined with more stone, a trough that collected not just water, but heat, radiating it back into the space long after the sun had moved on. She had seen this principle before. Read about it in one of Daniel's old farming magazines. Thermal mass, the way dense materials absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. But she had never seen it applied like this, never understood how powerful it could be when every element worked together. The inverted roof, she realized, wasn't just about water collection, though the central trough clearly served that purpose. It was about trapping heat. The warm air rising from the sun-heated stones would hit the inward-sloping glass and flow back down, creating convection currents that circulated heat throughout the space instead of letting it escape through a peaked roof the way conventional greenhouses did. Clara walked slowly down the central aisle, her boots echoing on the stone floor. Both sides of the greenhouse were planted, raised beds built from more stone, filled with rich dark soil that smelled of compost and minerals. Most of the beds held cold weather crops, more kale, chard, carrots with their feathery tops still green, even a few tomato plants that impossibly still had fruit, ripe fruit, in October, in Montana. At the far end of the greenhouse, tucked against the western wall, Clara found a small potting bench, and on that bench, weighted down with a smooth river stone, was an envelope with her name on it. Her hands were shaking as she picked it up. Frost sat at her feet, watching her with those dark, intelligent eyes, waiting to see what came next. Inside the envelope were 3 items: a hand-drawn map of the property showing the layout of the greenhouse and the garden beds, a small leather-bound journal, and a letter written in the same elegant handwriting from the photograph. Dear Clara, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you found my life's work. I'm sorry we never met. Your grandmother and I lost touch after the war, the way sisters do when distance and time and the ordinary failures of family get in the way. But I kept track of you. I knew when you married. I knew when your husband died. And I knew you would need this someday. Not the land, not the greenhouse, but what it represents. A way to stay warm when everything else is freezing. A way to grow when the rest of the world has given up for the season. A way to prove that what everyone calls impossible is just difficult. And difficult is something women like us have always known how to do. They laughed at me when I built this. The whole valley thought I was touched in the head. An old woman building an upside-down greenhouse on rocky ground where nothing but sage would grow. They said I was wasting my time and my late husband's money. They said I was too old to be starting projects I'd never finish. They said the design was backwards and the frost would kill everything, and I'd be hauling groceries from town like everyone else come January. They were wrong. I've harvested fresh vegetables every single day for 32 years, through winters that killed cattle and froze pipes and left the whole valley eating canned goods until spring. I've grown tomatoes in December and lettuce in February and greens that most people in this country never taste fresh because they can't survive the shipping from California. And I did it with a design that everyone mocked, with principles that went against everything the agricultural extension agents taught, with knowledge that came from the old country, from people who understood what it meant to survive on the edge of things, with a margin between thriving and starving was measured in degrees and days, and the willingness to think differently than everyone around you. The journal contains everything you need to know, the principles, the techniques, the specific orientations, and measurements that make this work. Study it, trust it, and when the town starts talking, and they will talk, remember that results speak louder than opinions. This greenhouse will keep you warm when you think you've frozen all the way through, not just physically, in all the ways that matter. Your grandmother understood cold like that, the kind that comes from inside. She built her own warmth in her own way. I think you will, too. Welcome home, child. Now start learning. With love across time. Aunt Ingrid. Clara read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring on the 3rd pass. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried since the funeral. Couldn't seem to find tears anymore even when she wanted them. But something in her chest was cracking open, some frozen place thawing in a way that was painful and necessary and long overdue. Frost leaned against her leg, his warmth steady and real. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Inside the greenhouse, the temperature was still warm, the stones releasing their stored heat into the growing space, keeping everything alive to the cold that was already settling over the mountains. Clara set the letter down carefully and picked up the journal. The first page was dated April 15th, 1952. The handwriting was younger, firmer, but recognizably the same. Today I broke ground on what everyone is calling Ingrid's folly. Herman passed 6 months ago. The bank wants to sell the place. My children want to move to Spokane and live with them in their warm house with central heating, and neighbors close enough to call if I fall. I'm not falling, and I'm not leaving. I'm building something they won't understand. Something that will still be producing when their children's children are buying grocery store tomatoes in January and wondering why nothing tastes like it should. I'm building it Herman's way, the way his grandfather taught him in Norway, the way people survived for centuries before anyone invented the word agriculture and decided there was only one right way to do things. The town will laugh. Let them. Laughter doesn't kill crops. Ignorance does. Clara closed the journal and held it against her chest. Through the glass walls, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars Ingrid had watched while building this impossible greenhouse. The same stars that had looked down on countless women who chose a difficult path because the easy one would have cost them something they couldn't afford to lose. She stood in the warmth of stones and glass and 3 decades of stubborn knowledge and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. Not happiness. Not yet, but purpose. Direction. A reason to get up tomorrow that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with possibility. Frost's tail thumped softly against the stone floor. "We're staying," Clara told him, her voice sounding strange after so much silence. "We're going to figure this out. We're going to learn how she did it. And when the town starts talking," she looked down at the journal in her hands, "we're going to prove them wrong." Clara spent the first week just watching. She drove up to the greenhouse every morning before dawn, Frost riding shotgun with his nose pressed to the window, breath fogging the glass. She would unlock the door and step into warmth that shouldn't exist, and she would sit on the stone floor with Ingrid's journal open in her lap, reading and observing and trying to understand the quiet magic of thermal mass and orientation, and all the principles her great-aunt had spent 32 years perfecting. The journal was meticulous. Ingrid had documented everything: daily temperatures inside and outside the greenhouse, the exact angle of winter sun at different times of year, which crops thrived in which beds and why, the precise thickness of the stone walls and how they absorb heat differently depending on their composition. She had drawn diagrams showing convection currents, water flow through the central trough, the way cold air settled in pockets that had to be managed rather than fought. It read like a conversation between science and intuition. Half of it was measurements and data. The other half was observations that could only come from years of patient attention. The kale in the northeast corner always grows sweeter after the first hard freeze. I think it's the way the morning sun hits the stone just before the shadows take over. The plants know they're being protected. They taste like gratitude. Clara had never read anything like it. The Extension Service pamphlets were all instructions and warnings. Do this. Don't do that. Here's the approved method for preventing frost damage. Ingrid's journal was alive. It breathed. It acknowledged mystery even as it pursued understanding. On the 3rd day, Clara brought a thermometer from home. She wanted to verify what Ingrid had recorded, to see if the numbers were real or if her great-aunt had been exaggerating for effect. The outside temperature that morning was 23 degrees. She could see her breath hanging in the air as she walked in the truck to the greenhouse door. Inside, the thermometer read 58 degrees. 58, with no supplemental heat, no propane heater, no wood stove, no electric coils running up utility bills. Just stone and glass and the knowledge of how to make them work together. Clara sat on the floor, staring at the thermometer in her hand, and felt something like awe. Her valley garden, for all its conventional design and proper southern exposure and carefully mulched beds, couldn't keep a single tomato alive past the first frost. This upside-down greenhouse, built on rocky ground where nothing should grow, was maintaining temperatures 35 degrees warmer than the outside air. It was impossible, except it wasn't. It was just physics. Thermal mass absorbing heat during the day, releasing it at night. The inverted roof trapping warm air instead of letting it escape. The earth berm providing insulation on the northern exposure. the precise angle of the glass maximizing solar gain during the low-arc winter sun. Impossible and physics were two different things, Clara realized. Most people just couldn't tell them apart. She started spending entire days at the greenhouse. She would drive up at dawn with a thermos of coffee and sandwich, and she wouldn't leave until dusk painted the valley purple and frost started whining at the door. She read Ingrid's journal cover to cover, then started over from the beginning, this time taking notes, cross-referencing observations, try to understand not just what her great-aunt had done, but why. The why mattered. Clara had spent 3 years going through motions without understanding their purpose. She had kept the house clean, because that's what you did. She had maintained the garden because it had always been there. She had stayed in the valley because leaving felt like betrayal. But none of it had meant anything. None of it had connected to something larger than simple routine. This was different. Every measurement in Ingrid's journal served a purpose. Every stone in those thick walls had been chosen for its thermal properties. Every angle of glass had been calculated to capture maximum sunlight during the months when the sun barely cleared the southern peaks. Nothing was arbitrary. Nothing was just tradition masquerading as wisdom. It was knowledge, hard-won, carefully recorded, passed down with explicit hope that someone would value it enough to continue the work. On the 8th day, Clara encountered her first skeptic. She was kneeling in one of the raised beds, checking soil moisture and making notes about which crops Ingrid had planted where, when she heard a truck coming up the drive. Frost's ears went forward, alert but not alarmed. A moment later, someone knocked on the greenhouse door. Clara stood, brushing soil from her knees, and found herself facing a man in his 60s wearing a Carhartt jacket and a feed and seed cap. She recognized him vaguely. Someone from one of the valley ranches, though she couldn't remember his name. "Heard somebody was up here," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Didn't know old Ingrid had left the place to anyone." "She was my great-aunt," Clara said. "I inherited it when she passed." The man looked past her into the greenhouse, his expression shifting from curiosity to something that might have been amusement. "That's Ingrid's crazy greenhouse, isn't it? Heard about it for years, but never seen it up close." Something in his tone, that casual dismissal wrapped in folksy friendliness, made Clara's jaw tighten. "It's not crazy. It's brilliant." He laughed. Actually laughed. "Well, I don't know about brilliant. Backwards is what most folks called it. Ingrid was a nice lady, don't get me wrong, but she had some odd ideas about farming. Built that thing upside down and expected it to work." "It does work," Clara said quietly. "It's been working for 32 years. The man shrugged. "If you say so. Personally, I think she just got lucky with the location. That south-facing slope catches good sun. But come January, when it's 10 below and the wind's blowing 40 miles an hour, you'll see what I mean. Thing'll freeze up just like everything else. Probably crack all that glass she put in it, too." He tipped his cap politely and headed back to his truck, leaving Clara standing in the doorway with her hands clenched into fists and frost pressing against her leg in that way he had when he sensed her anger. "He's wrong," she told the dog. "They're all wrong. Ingrid proved it. The data proves it." But later that night, lying in bed in her too-quiet house, Clara found herself doubting. Not the data. Ingrid's records were too detailed, too consistent to dismiss. But her own ability to maintain what her great-aunt had built. Clara wasn't a scientist. She wasn't even a particularly good gardener. She was just a widow trying to find something to care about that didn't hurt too much to touch. What made her think she could master a system that the whole valley had dismissed as foolishness? The next morning, Clara drove into town for supplies. She needed seed-starting mix and trays, some tools for working the greenhouse beds, maybe a few reference books on cold-weather gardening. The feed store was the only place within 20 miles that carried such things, a sprawling barn of a building that smelled like grain and leather, and a particular combination of hope and desperation that characterized agricultural retail. She was comparing bags of potting soil when she heard the voices. Mendsen woman, up at the old Halvorsen place. Ingrid's niece or something, I heard. Great niece. Inherited that weird greenhouse Ingrid built back in the 50s. The upside-down one? Lord, I remember when she put that thing up. My daddy said she'd wasted her money on a design that would never work. Said anyone could see the roof was backwards. Did it work? A pause. Well, Ingrid claimed it did, but you know how old folks get. Stubborn about admitting when they're wrong. Wonder if the Mendsen woman will tear it down. Probably ought to. Start fresh with something sensible. Clara set the bag of soil down carefully and walked out of the store. She got as far as her truck before the shaking started. Not tears. She still couldn't cry, just a trembling in her hands that spread to her arms and shoulders and finally her whole body. They thought Ingrid was lying. 32 years of documented success, of fresh vegetables through every winter, of a design that worked exactly as intended, and they thought she was lying, or delusional, or too stubborn to admit failure, because the roof was backwards, because it looked wrong, because everyone knew there was only one right way to build a greenhouse, and Ingrid's way wasn't it. Frost whined from the passenger seat. Clara climbed into the truck and sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. This was what Ingrid had faced, this casual dismissal, this certainty that conventional wisdom trumped documented results, this willingness to believe that an old woman living alone was either a liar or a fool, because the alternative, that she had figured out something they didn't understand, was too threatening to accept. Clara started the engine and drove straight back to the greenhouse. She spent the rest of the day measuring everything. The thickness of the stone walls, 19 inches on the north side, 14 on the east and west. The angle of the glass panels, 67 degrees from horizontal, designed to catch the low winter sun, nearly perpendicular. The depth of the central trough, 8 inches, lined with dark river stones that absorbed and held heat. The thermal mass of the floor, she calculated it roughly at 12 cubic yards of stone, enough to store significant heat through even the longest winter nights. She recorded temperatures every hour, noting how they fluctuated with the sun's movement, how the stone walls moderated the swings, how even as the outside temperature dropped into the teens after sunset, the greenhouse interior never fell below 52 degrees. She wasn't doing this for the skeptics. They wouldn't believe data any more than they believed Ingrid's word. She was doing it for herself, building proof, creating a record that would stand against doubt, theirs and her own. That evening, she pulled out Ingrid's journal and found an entry from December 1953. Today, Chester Hansen came by to tell me my greenhouse would never survive a real Montana winter. He was kind enough about it, in that condescending way men have when they think they're protecting women from our own foolish ideas. He explained that thermal mass only works in mild climates, that the design was fine for California, maybe but suicidal this far north. I showed him my temperature logs. He said I must have made a mistake in my readings. I showed him my January harvest, kale and chard and lettuce that would cost him $3 a pound if he could even find it in Missoula this time of year. He said I must have brought it from town and was pulling his leg. There is no arguing with a man who has already decided you're wrong. His certainty is more comfortable than your evidence. I stopped trying to convince them after that. I just kept growing, kept harvesting, kept warm through winters that froze their pipes and killed their livestock. Eventually, a few of them started paying attention. The ones who valued results over tradition. The ones who were willing to look foolish asking an old woman for advice. Those are the only ones worth teaching anyway. Clara closed the journal and looked around the greenhouse. The tomato plants in the western beds were heavy with fruit. She could smell the earthy sweetness of ripening vegetables, could feel the warmth radiating from stones that had been soaking up October sun all day. Outside, frost was already forming on her truck's windshield. Ingrid was right. There was no point in arguing with people who had already decided you were wrong. The only answer was results. And Clara was going to get results. She started by studying Ingrid's planting calendar. November through February were the critical months, when conventional wisdom said nothing would grow, when grocery stores became the only source of fresh produce, when people resigned themselves to canned goods and frozen vegetables shipped from distant places with actual growing seasons. But Ingrid's calendar showed continuous planting and harvesting, lettuce seeded every 2 weeks for continuous salad greens, spinach and arugula, and Asian greens Clara had never heard of. Cold, hardy varieties of kale and chard. Even carrots and beets that could be harvested throughout the winter if the beds were properly mulched and the greenhouse maintained its thermal balance. The key, Clara realized as she read deeper into the journal, wasn't just the structure itself. It was understanding how to work with it. When to vent excess heat on unseasonably warm days. How to manage moisture that would condense on the glass during cold nights. Which beds stayed warmest based on their proximity to the stone walls, where cold pockets formed, and how to either avoid them or use them strategically for crops that preferred cooler temperatures. It was a living system, not a static one. It required attention, adjustment, the kind of intimate knowledge that could only come from daily observation over years. Clara had years now. That's what Ingrid had given her. Time to learn, time to practice, time to become the kind of gardener who understood plants not as objects to be managed, but as partners in a complex dance of light and heat and moisture and soil. She began spending nights at the greenhouse. Not inside, that would have been strange, excessive, but in her truck parked at the edge of the clearing. Frost curled on the passenger seat, and a sleeping bag pulled up to her chin. She would set an alarm for midnight and 3 a.m., waking to check temperatures, to observe how the stones released their heat through the darkness, to listen to the wind moving across the inverted roof, and understand why Ingrid had designed the central trough with its specific depth and slope. Her house in the valley felt more like a museum every day, a place where she stored the remnants of a life that had ended 3 years ago. The greenhouse felt like something else. Not home, not exactly, but possibility. A place where what came next could be different from what had been. On November 5th, Clara planted her first crop, lettuce, a cold, hardy variety called Arctic King that Ingrid's notes said would germinate even in cool soil and tolerate temperatures down to 20 degrees if properly hardened off. She prepared the bed exactly as the journal instructed, mixing compost and sand into the existing soil, creating slight furrows for drainage, spacing the seeds precisely. Then she waited. 5 days later, tiny green shoots pushed through the soil. Clara knelt beside the bed, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the delicate leaves. She had planted hundreds of seeds in her life, had watched hundreds of plants emerge and grow and produce. But this felt different. These seeds were growing in November, in Montana, in temperatures that should have kept them dormant until spring. They were growing because Clara had created conditions that made growth possible, not through brute force or artificial manipulation, but by understanding and working with principles that had sustained life in harsh climates for millennia. She took a photograph of the seedlings and texted it to her sister, without explanation. 3 hours later, her phone rang. "Is that what I think it is?" Sarah's voice carried equal parts confusion and concern. "Lettuce," Clara said. "Planted 6 days ago. Growing in a greenhouse I inherited. In November?" "In November." A long pause. "Clara, are you okay? I mean, really okay? Because you've been quiet. And now you're sending me pictures of lettuce and talking about greenhouses. And I'm worried that maybe—" "I'm not falling apart," Clara interrupted. "I'm learning something. I'm interested in something. For the first time since Daniel died, I'm interested in something that isn't just about getting through another day." Another pause, softer this time. "Tell me about it." So Clara did. She told Sarah about the letter from the attorney, about finding the greenhouse with its impossible design, about Ingrid's journal, and the 32 years of documented success that the valley had dismissed as either luck or lies. She told her about the thermal mass and the inverted roof, and the way stone could hold heat the way nothing else could. She told her about purpose. Sarah listened without interrupting. Then, "What are you going to do?" Clara looked through her truck windshield at the greenhouse, its glass panels glowing faintly in the starlight. "I'm going to prove it works. I'm going to document everything the way Ingrid did. And when winter comes, real winter, the kind that the valley thinks will kill everything, I'm going to harvest fresh vegetables while everyone else is eating canned corn and wondering why nothing from the grocery store tastes like it should. And if it doesn't work, if the design fails or the glass cracks or whatever it is that everyone says will happen—" Clara smiled, surprised by the expression. She hadn't smiled in months. "Then at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have spent the winter learning something instead of just surviving it. That's not nothing, Sarah said quietly. No, Clara agreed. It's not nothing. By mid-November, the valley was locked into the pattern that would hold until March. Cold nights dropping into the single digits, brief warming during sunny afternoons, and the ever-present threat of the Arctic fronts that could sweep down from Canada and drop temperatures to 30 below for days at a time. Clara's valley garden was gone entirely now. The beds empty except for the skeletal remains of summer plants. Her neighbors had long since harvested their last vegetables, storing potatoes and carrots and squash in root cellars, canning what they could, resigning themselves to months of limited fresh produce. But Clara was harvesting lettuce. She brought the first batch to Sarah's house in Missoula, appearing unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, with a bag full of greens that were still cold from the drive, but very much alive. Sarah opened the bag, pulled out a handful of leaves, and just stared. This is from your greenhouse? Planted November 5th. Harvested this morning. Sarah washed a leaf and tasted it. Her eyes widened. Clara, this is incredible. It tastes like summer. How is this possible? Clara pulled out her phone and showed her the temperature logs, the photographs of the greenhouse interior, the thermometer readings that proved the system was maintaining temperatures 40 degrees warmer than outside air with no supplemental heat. She showed her sections of Ingrid's journal, the careful documentation of 3 decades of winter harvests. It's not magic, Clara said. It's just physics that most people don't bother to understand. Sarah set down the lettuce and looked at her sister, really looked at her, for the first time in months. You look different. I feel different. Good different. Clara thought about it. Awake different. Like I've been sleepwalking for 3 years, and I'm finally starting to remember what it feels like to be present in my own life. Sarah hugged her then, hard and sudden, the way she had at the funeral when words had failed and only physical presence seemed to matter. I'm glad, she whispered. I've missed you. I've missed me, too, Clara said and meant it. On the drive back to the valley, Clara stopped at the feed store. The same man who had been talking about her greenhouse was behind the counter, ringing up a farmer's order of stock tank heaters and extension cords, the equipment necessary to keep water from freezing when winter hit hard. Clara waited until he was finished, then set her bag on the counter. I wanted to show you something, she said. She pulled out a head of lettuce. Fresh, green, impossible. The man stared. Where'd you get that? From Ingrid's greenhouse. The backwards one. The one everyone said would never work. His face went through several expressions, surprise, confusion, and finally something that might have been embarrassment. You grew that? This month. Planted it November 5th. Harvested it this morning, along with kale, chard, spinach, and enough arugula to make salad for a week. She packed the lettuce back into her bag. Ingrid's design wasn't backwards. It was just different. And different works, if you're willing to pay attention to why. She left him standing there, mouth slightly open, holding a receipt he'd forgotten to give the farmer. Frost was grinning when she got back to the truck, his tongue hanging out in that way dogs have when they're pleased about something they can't quite explain. Clara scratched behind his ears and felt something unfamiliar bubbling up in her chest. Pride, she realized, not arrogance, not smugness, just the simple satisfaction of proving that what everyone dismissed as impossible was really just difficult. And difficult was something she knew how to do. The first real test came the week before Thanksgiving. A cold front swept down from Alberta, bringing temperatures that dropped to 18 below zero and winds that screamed across the valley at 40 miles per hour. The kind of cold that froze diesel fuel and cracked water pipes and made venturing outside feel like a form of violence against yourself. Clara drove to the greenhouse at dawn, terrified of what she would find. The wind had been howling all night, rattling her windows and reminding her of every warning she'd heard about glass structures in extreme weather. What if the panels had cracked? What if the convection system had failed? What if all those confident temperature logs were meaningless in the face of real Montana winter? But when she unlocked the door and stepped inside, warmth wrapped around her like a living thing. 54 degrees. 18 below outside, 54 inside, and nothing was cracked. Nothing had failed. The system was working exactly as Ingrid had designed it to work, as it had worked for 32 years through weather just as brutal as this. Clara stood in the center of the greenhouse with tears streaming down her face. The first tears she had cried since the funeral. Not tears of grief this time, but something else. Relief maybe, or vindication, or just the overwhelming recognition that Ingrid had been right, that the valley had been wrong, that sometimes the answer everyone dismissed as foolishness was actually the only answer that worked. She harvested kale that morning with hands that shook from something that wasn't cold. The leaves were thick and dark green, frosted with morning condensation, but very much alive, growing, thriving, completely indifferent to the killing cold just beyond the glass. When she got home, she called Sarah. "It worked," was all she said. 18 below, and it worked. "Of course it worked," Sarah replied. "You knew it would." "No," Clara said honestly. "I hoped it would. But hope and knowledge aren't the same thing. Now I know." That afternoon, she started writing. Not a journal like Ingrid's, not yet, but notes, observations, data that would become proof, that would become knowledge, that might, someday, become wisdom passed down to someone who needed it the way Clara had needed it. She wrote about thermal mass and solar gain, and the physics of trapping heat. But she also wrote about what it felt like to stand in that greenhouse on the coldest morning of the year and understand that Ingrid had built more than just a structure. She had built a demonstration, a proof of concept, a middle finger to everyone who said it couldn't be done, wrapped in 19 inches of carefully stacked stone and 32 years of stubborn persistence. The valley would keep talking. Clara knew that. They would find reasons to dismiss her success, to attribute it to luck or location, or anything except Ingrid's design actually working the way Ingrid said it would. But Clara didn't care anymore. She had proof. She had results. She had lettuce growing in November and kale surviving 18 below, and a system that worked because someone had taken the time to understand what the land needed instead of just imposing what tradition demanded. And she had purpose. Not the hollow kind that came from obligation, but the real kind. The kind that made you wake up eager to see what the day would teach you. The kind that made you believe that what came next might actually be better than what had been. Frost pressed against her leg, his warmth steady and real. Outside, the wind was still howling. But inside Clara's chest, something had shifted. Some frozen place was thawing. Some shut-down part of her was coming back to life. Slowly, carefully, but undeniably, like lettuce seeds germinating in November soil. Like hope growing in conditions that should have killed it. Like a woman learning to be warm again when everyone said she'd frozen all the way through. December arrived with a vengeance. The kind of month that made even lifelong Montanans question their choices. Temperatures that stayed below zero for days at a time. Snowfall that measured in feet rather than inches. And wind chills that made stepping outside feel like a form of madness. Clara's propane bills for heating her house tripled. Her neighbors spent small fortunes on stock tank heaters and heat lamps for livestock. The hardware store in town sold out of insulation and weather stripping. Everyone was fighting the cold, burning resources, battling nature with brute force and expensive fuel. Clara was harvesting tomatoes. Not many, just a handful of cherry tomatoes from the plants she had carefully nurtured in the warmest corner of the greenhouse, the spot where the western stone wall met the southern glass, and created a microclimate that stayed 10 degrees warmer than the rest of the structure. But they were real, ripe, impossible tomatoes growing in December, Montana, while the world outside was locked in ice. She brought one to the feed store on a gray afternoon when the temperature gauge outside read -12. The same man who had dismissed Ingrid's design was behind the counter again, this time selling a rancher $300 worth of propane heaters. Clara waited until the transaction was complete, then set the tomato on the counter. It sat there like a small red miracle, glossy and perfect, completely out of season, out of context. The man stared at it. "What's that?" "A tomato. Picked it this morning from Ingrid's greenhouse." He picked it up, turned it over in his hands like it might be a trick. A wax replica. Something from the grocery store passed off as homegrown. "This is from the greenhouse?" "The one up on the Halvorsen place." "The backwards one," Clara said pleasantly. the one that was supposed to freeze solid and crack all the glass. His face went through several colors. How? Thermal mass, solar gain, proper orientation. All the things Ingrid documented 32 years ago that everyone was too certain was impossible to actually pay attention to. She left the tomato on the counter and walked out. Behind her, she could hear the rancher asking questions, his voice carrying the kind of interest that came from spending $300 to fight a problem someone else had apparently solved with rocks and glass. That evening, Clara got her first phone call. "This is Bill Garrett." The voice said, "Older man, rough from years of weather and tobacco. I run cattle on the East Bench. Heard you got vegetables growing up at the Halvorson place." Clara waited, wondered if you'd be willing to show me how you're doing it. Not looking to steal any secrets. Just, my wife used a garden. Past 5 years ago. I'd like to grow her some tomatoes again. Even if she's not here to eat them, I'd like to grow them. Something in Clara's chest cracked a little wider. "Come by tomorrow around 10, she said. "Bring a notebook." He showed up at 9:30, driving a truck older than Clara and carrying a spiral notebook that looked like it had been through multiple Montana winters. Frost greeted him with a cautious tail wag, reserved for strangers who might become friends, and Clara led him into the greenhouse. Bill Garrett stood in the center of the space, turning slowly, taking an inverted roof and the stone walls and the raised beds full of green growing things. His face worked through emotions Clara was beginning to recognize, disbelief giving way to understanding, certainty crumbling against evidence, the painful realization that something you dismissed as foolish was actually brilliant. "I knew Ingrid," he said finally. Used to see her at the feed store, buying seeds in January when everyone else was buying stock salt. Thought she was touched. Felt sorry for her, living alone up here with her crazy ideas. He ran his hand along the stone wall, feeling the warmth radiating from it. "I owe her an apology. 32 years too late, but I owe it all the same." Clara pulled out Ingrid's journal. She didn't need apologies. She needed people to pay attention, to value results over tradition, to be willing to learn from someone who looked different than what they expected a teacher to look like. She walked him through the principles, showed him the temperature logs, explained the physics of thermal mass, demonstrated how the inverted roof created convection currents that conventional peat designs couldn't achieve. She showed him which crops grew where and why, how to manage moisture when event excess heat. Bill took notes, careful, detailed notes in handwriting that shook slightly from age or cold or the weight of realizing you've been wrong for 3 decades. When he left, he shook Clara's hand with both of his own. "Thank you for this, for not holding it against us that we were too stupid to listen when we had the chance." "You're listening now," Clara said. "That's what matters." After he left, she updated her own journal, the one she had started keeping in parallel with Ingrid's, documenting not just data, but the human side of this knowledge transfer. The resistance, the skepticism, the slow, grudging acceptance that came when results became too obvious to ignore. December 8th, first conversion. Bill Garrett, 73 years old, raising cattle his whole life. Lost his wife 5 years ago. Wants to grow tomatoes for her memory. Spent 2 hours asking questions I wouldn't have been able to answer a month ago. Left with notes and seeds and something that looked like hope. Ingrid was right. You can't argue people into believing. You can only grow the evidence and wait for them to be ready to see it. The conversions came slowly at first, then faster. A woman from the organic co-op in Missoula who wanted to know if the design could be scaled up for commercial production. A young couple trying a homestead on marginal land who couldn't afford the propane to heat a conventional greenhouse. A retired engineer who had dismissed Ingrid's design as thermodynamically impossible and now wanted to understand exactly why he'd been wrong. Clara showed them all. She walked them through the greenhouse, explained the principles, shared Ingrid's documentation, and her own growing understanding of how the system worked. She gave away seeds and advice and copies of temperature logs. Some of them started building their own versions, modified designs adapted to their specific conditions and needs, but following the core principles Ingrid had proven: thermal mass, proper orientation, working with physics rather than fighting it. Clara began keeping a map, marking each new greenhouse that grew from Ingrid's original design. Within 6 weeks, there were 12. Within 3 months, 27. A network of inverted structures spreading across the valley like a quiet revolution in stone and glass. The Extension Service finally noticed in January. A young woman named Dr. Sarah Chin showed up unannounced, carrying a clipboard and an air of professional skepticism. She introduced herself as an agricultural engineer specializing in sustainable growing systems, sent by the university to investigate reports of anomalous winter production in unheated structures. Clara almost laughed at the careful language. Anomalous, as if success was somehow stranger than failure. She let Dr. Chin measure everything: temperature, humidity, light levels, soil composition, the thermal properties of the stone walls, the R value of the glass panels, the exact angle of the roof slope. She watched the younger woman work through calculations on a tablet, her expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something that might have been awe. "This shouldn't work," Dr. Chin said finally. "According to every model I have for this climate zone, you should need supplemental heat to maintain these temperatures." And yet, Clara gestured at the lettuce, the kale, the chard, the impossible tomatoes still producing in the warmest corner. "And yet," Dr. Chin echoed. She sat down on the stone floor, right there in her professional clothes with her expensive equipment scattered around her, and said, "Tell me everything." So Clara did. She told her about Ingrid, about 32 years of documentation that everyone had dismissed. She showed her the journals, the meticulous records, the evidence that had been waiting 3 decades for someone to value it. She told her about the town's mockery, about the casual certainty that an old woman building an upside-down greenhouse was either lying about her results or too stubborn to admit failure. She told her about the resistance Clara had faced, about the assumptions people made about what was possible and what wasn't. Dr. Chin listened, taking notes, occasionally stopping Clara to ask for clarification or to verify measurements. When Clara finished, the engineer sat quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what you have here?" she said finally. "This isn't just a greenhouse. It's a proof of concept for low-energy food production in extreme climates. The thermal mass approach, the convection management, the strategic use of orientation and materials. This could be adapted for regions across the northern tier. Alaska, northern Canada. Anywhere food security is compromised by short growing seasons and energy costs." Ingrid knew that, Clara said quietly. She wrote about it in her journal. She said the design worked anywhere people were willing to understand why instead of just assuming it couldn't. Dr. Chin looked around the greenhouse again, her professional assessment shifting into something more personal. Why didn't anyone listen to her? Why did it take 32 years for someone to pay attention? Clara thought about the man at the feed store, about the casual dismissal in the voices she'd heard, about all the years Ingrid had worked in isolation, because the valley was more comfortable with their certainty than her evidence, because she was an old woman building something that looked wrong, because she didn't have credentials or institutional backing, because people would rather believe she was crazy than admit she understood something they didn't. "That's going to change," Dr. Chin said. "I'm publishing this. I'm going to document this system, credit your Gray Tant's work, and make sure every agricultural program in the northern states knows that this approach works. If you'll let me." Clara felt frost press against her leg. Outside, January wind was howling across the valley, carrying snow and cold that would kill anything exposed to it. Inside, tomatoes ripened and lettuce grew, and 32 years of indication finally found someone willing to carry it forward into official recognition. Ingrid would like that, Clara said. She wanted the knowledge to spread. She wanted it to help people. That's why she left it to me, to make sure it didn't die with her. "It won't," Dr. Chin promised. "I'll make sure of that." The article came out in March, published in the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture, with Ingrid Halvorsen listed as the primary innovator and Clara as the current practitioner and knowledge keeper. Thermal Mass Greenhouse Design for Extreme Cold Climates. A 32-year case study, it was titled, with photographs of the greenhouse, graphs of temperature data, and detailed schematics of Ingrid's design. It went viral in agricultural circles. Not social media viral. This was academic viral. the kind that spread through university departments and extension services, and farming networks that valued innovation over tradition. Within a month, Clara was getting emails from Alaska, northern Minnesota, the Dakotas, even Norway, where Ingrid's husband's family had come from. Everyone wanted to know more, wanted plans, wanted to understand how to adapt the design to their specific conditions, wanted to prove to their own skeptical communities that winter food production without fossil fuels wasn't just possible, but practical. Clara responded to every email. She scanned pages from Ingrid's journal, shared her own temperature logs and planning calendars, connected people with each other so they could share what they learned. She became, without quite meaning to, the center of a network of cold climate growers all working from the same basic principles Ingrid had proven decades ago. The valley's attitude shifted, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small incremental ways that added up to something that felt like respect. The feed store started stocking the specific seed varieties Clara recommended for winter growing. The local newspaper ran a feature on the Halvorsen greenhouse, with photographs and apology buried in the middle of the article for the years the valley had dismissed Ingrid's work. People Clara didn't know started waving when they passed her on the road, asking questions at the post office, admitting they'd been wrong to mock what they didn't understand. But the vindication that mattered most came from a different source entirely. In early April, when the valley was just beginning to thaw and the first brave crocuses were pushing through the snow, Clara received a package from Norway. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The letter was from a woman named Kristin Halvorsen, Ingrid's sister's granddaughter, explaining that the family had seen Dr. Chen's article, that they had kept some of Ingrid's correspondence from before she stopped writing, before the distance became too great to bridge with letters alone. We thought Aunt Ingrid was eccentric. Kristin wrote, living alone in the American mountains, writing about greenhouses and thermal mass and growing tomatoes in winter. We thought she was lonely and perhaps a bit delusional. We feel ashamed now. She wasn't delusional. She was brilliant, and we should have listened. The photograph showed a greenhouse in northern Norway, partially earth-bermed, south-facing, with an inverted roof that sloped inward toward a central trough. We built this last summer. Kristin's letter continued, following Aunt Ingrid's principles as described in your article. It is our first winter using it. We have harvested kale and lettuce and carrots all through December and January. Our neighbors call it the American greenhouse. We call it Ingrid's legacy. Thank you for making sure her knowledge didn't die with her. Thank you for honoring what she built. Clara sat in the greenhouse. Her greenhouse now, truly hers, with a letter in her lap and tears streaming down her face. The good kind of tears. The kind that came from understanding that what you were doing mattered beyond yourself, that knowledge passed down could grow and spread, and help people you would never meet in places you would never see. Frost laid his head on her knee, patient and warm. Outside, spring was coming slowly to the Bitterroot Valley. The aspens were budding. The creek was running high with snowmelt. The world was waking up from its long frozen sleep, and Claire was awake, too, finally, completely. Not the same person she'd been before Daniel died. That person was gone, and mourning her was pointless. But someone knew, someone who understood that the opposite of grief wasn't happiness, but purpose. That the way out of numbness wasn't through feeling less, but through caring more. Someone who could stand in a greenhouse built by a woman she never met, and understand that family wasn't just blood. It was knowledge passed down. It was wisdom honored. It was the choice to carry forward what mattered, even when everyone around you said it didn't. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible mountain stories like this one. By May, Clara had started teaching formal workshops. Every other Saturday, weather permitting, she would open the greenhouse to anyone who wanted to learn. She charged nothing. Knowledge, she had decided, worked best when it flowed freely, but she asked everyone to bring something to share, a technique they'd learned, a variety that grew well in their conditions, a modification they'd made to the basic design. The workshops became a kind of community, not the traditional kind based on geography or shared history, but something more intentional, people drawn together by curiosity, by the willingness to try something different, by the understanding that the best solutions often came from the margins rather than the mainstream. Bill Garrett came to every session, his notebook filling with observations and sketches. He was building his own greenhouse now, a smaller version adapted for his needs, oriented specifically to grow the heirloom tomatoes his wife had loved. He brought seedlings to share, started from seeds Clara had given him, and his hand shook a little when people asked him questions, as if he might have knowledge worth sharing. Dr. Chun came when her schedule allowed, bringing students from the university who were writing theses on sustainable agriculture and low-energy food systems. They measured and documented, and asked questions that pushed Clara to understand the principles at deeper levels. Teaching, she discovered, was its own form of learning, and slowly, quietly, the valley changed. Not overnight, not completely. There were still skeptics, still people who preferred their certainty to evidence, still voices that whispered about city ideas and impractical designs and solutions that might work in theory, but would never survive real-world conditions. But they were quieter now, drowned out by results, by the growing network of inverted greenhouses producing food through winter, by the undeniable fact that what everyone had called impossible was happening in yards and on homesteads and in backyards across the valley. Clara kept Ingrid's journal in a place of honor on the potting bench, protected in a clear plastic case, so people could read it during workshops, but it would stay preserved. She had added her own journal beside it, smaller, less detailed, but documenting the same kind of daily observations and growing understanding. Someday, she thought, she might leave both to someone who needed them, someone standing where she had stood a year ago, numb and lost, and looking for someone to care about that didn't hurt too much to touch. Someone who needed to know that grief didn't have to be the end of the story, that frozen things could thaw, that growth was possible even in conditions that should have killed everything. The anniversary came in October, 1 year since the letter had arrived. 1 year since Clara had driven up to a greenhouse she didn't know existed and found a legacy she didn't know she needed. She marked it quietly. No celebration, no announcement. Just a morning spent in the greenhouse with Frost, working the soil and planting the winter crops that would see her through another Montana cold season. Lettuce, kale, chard, spinach, arugula, all the things Ingrid had planted. All the things that would grow through darkness and cold, because someone had understood that survival wasn't about fighting the mountain, but about learning what it needed. The tomato plants in the western corner were heavy with green fruit that would ripen through November and December. The stone walls radiated warmth absorbed from the autumn sun. The inverted roof caught light and held it, creating conditions for life in a season of death. Clara stood in the center of the space and felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Gratitude, not for what she'd lost. She would always carry Daniel's absence like a weight in her chest, but for what she'd found. For Ingrid's wisdom, for Frost's loyalty, for the community of growers who had found each other through shared curiosity, for Dr. Chen's validation, for Bill Garrett's transformation, for every person who had been willing to look at something that appeared backwards and ask why, instead of just assuming it was wrong, for the knowledge that she could be useful, that she could carry something forward, that her life could have meaning beyond just surviving it. The greenhouse thermometer read 62 degrees. Outside, the first frost was predicted for tonight. The cycle was beginning again. Another winter coming. Another season of cold and darkness, and the kind of isolation that could break you if you let it. But Clara wasn't afraid. She had stone walls that held heat. She had glass that caught light. She had soil that would support life through the frozen months. She had a system that worked because someone had taken the time to understand it, to prove it, to document it, to pass it down with explicit hope that someone would value it. And she had purpose. The kind that got you up in the morning. The kind that made you believe the work you were doing mattered beyond yourself. Frost pressed against her leg, warm and solid and real. Clara scratched behind his ears and looked around the greenhouse that had saved her life in ways that had nothing to do with vegetables and everything to do with hope. "Thank you, Ingrid," she said out loud, her voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. "Thank you for building this. Thank you for documenting it. Thank you for not giving up when everyone said you were wrong. Thank you for leaving it to someone who needed it." The greenhouse didn't answer. Of course it didn't. It was just stone and glass and 32 years of stubborn persistence made manifest in a structure that defied conventional wisdom and proved that sometimes the people everyone dismisses as crazy are just thinking more clearly than everyone else. But Clara felt the answer anyway, in the warmth of the stones, in the green of the growing plants, in the impossible tomatoes ripening in October, Montana. The answer was, you're welcome. Now keep growing, keep teaching. Keep proving that different doesn't mean wrong. Keep showing people that the way out of cold is warmth, and warmth comes from understanding rather than fighting. Keep building. Keep planting. Keep believing that what looks backwards might actually be the only way forward. Keep living. Clara wiped her eyes and got back to work. There were seeds to plant, temperatures to log, people to teach, a winter to prepare for and survive, and maybe, if she was lucky, even enjoy. The valley had called Ingrid crazy. They had called her stubborn. They had called her touched in the head for building an upside-down greenhouse that would never work. And Ingrid had grown tomatoes through 32 Montana winters while they ate canned vegetables and wondered why nothing tasted like it should. Now Clara was growing tomatoes and teaching others to do the same and spreading knowledge that had almost been lost because everyone was too certain it was impossible to actually try. The town had mocked the upside-down greenhouse, until winter harvest silenced them all, not with arguments, not with explanations, with results, with lettuce in January, with tomatoes in December, with proof that sometimes the answer everyone dismisses is the only answer that works. Clara planted the last row of lettuce seeds and covered them gently with soil. Outside, the sun was setting behind the Sapphire Mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Inside the greenhouse, the temperature was rising as the stone walls absorbed the last of the day's light, storing it for the long night ahead. She had survived grief. She had survived loss. She had survived 3 years of numbness that felt like its own kind of death. And now she was doing more than surviving. She was growing, in October, in Montana, in conditions that should have killed everything, but didn't, because someone had understood that impossible and difficult were two different things. And difficult was something women like Clara and Ingrid had always known how to do. Epilogue, the new life. 3 years later, on a bright January morning when the temperature outside read -8 degrees, Clara stood in the greenhouse and harvested tomatoes for her workshop participants. 20 people had signed up. They came from across the valley and beyond, ranchers and homesteaders, retirees and young families, even a delegation from the tribal lands who wanted to know if the design could work on the reservation, where food security was an ongoing challenge. Clara had expanded the greenhouse, not the original structure. That remained exactly as Ingrid had built it, a testament to principles that worked across decades. But she had added 2 more buildings following the same design, creating a complex of inverted roof greenhouses that produced vegetables year-round and served as a teaching laboratory for anyone willing to learn. The valley called it the Halvorsen Learning Center now, not Clara's greenhouse, not the crazy upside-down structure. The Halvorsen Learning Center, in honor of the woman who had built the first one and documented everything so carefully that her great-niece could pick up the work 3 decades later and carry it forward. Bill Garrett was there, 76 now and growing tomatoes in his own greenhouse that he had built with his son and grandson. He brought seedlings to share, started from seeds that could trace their lineage back to Ingrid's original varieties. Dr. Chung came with a film crew from a documentary series about sustainable agriculture. They were featuring the greenhouse in an episode about low-energy food production, about solutions that work without relying on fossil fuels or expensive technology. And Kristen Halvorsen had flown in from Norway, bringing photographs of 14 greenhouses across Scandinavia, all built using Ingrid's principles, all producing food through Arctic winters, all proving that what worked in Montana worked anywhere people were willing to understand why. Clara stood in front of the group with Frost at her side, grayer now, slower, but still a companion in all things, and held up a tomato. "This shouldn't exist," she said. "According to everything we're taught about growing food in cold climates, this tomato is impossible. It's January in Montana. It's -8 degrees outside. And yet here it is." She set the tomato on the potting bench beside Ingrid's journal. My great-aunt Ingrid built the first version of this greenhouse in 1952. The valley called her crazy. They said her design was backwards. They said it would never work. They were so certain she was wrong that they dismissed 32 years of evidence proving she was right. Clara looked around at the faces watching her. Young and old, experienced farmers and complete beginners. People who had driven hours just to understand how stone and glass and orientation could create conditions for life in the middle of winter. Ingrid didn't need their approval. She had results. And results, it turns out, are more persuasive than opinion. Eventually, she picked up the journal, handling it with the reverence it deserved. Everything you need to know is in here. The principles, the measurements, the techniques. Ingrid spent 32 years documenting her work, and she left it to me with one instruction. Share it. Make sure the knowledge doesn't die. Make sure people understand that different doesn't mean wrong. Clara opened the journal to a page she had marked months ago, one of Ingrid's last entries, written in handwriting that shook with age but remained determined. I am old now, alone. The valley still thinks I'm crazy, though some of them are starting to ask questions. Starting to wonder why my greenhouse keeps producing when theirs sit empty through winter. I don't need them to understand. I just need someone to carry this forward. Someone who will value what I learned. Someone who will keep growing. Someone will come. I know it. Someone who needs this as much as I needed to build it. Someone who understands that survival is about more than just staying alive. It's about finding something worth staying alive for. Someone who knows what it feels like to be frozen all the way through and needs to remember how to be warm again. Clara's voice caught. She looked up at the group watching her, saw her own journey reflected in some of their faces. The grief, the doubt, the slow awakening that came from finding purpose in unexpected places. Ingrid built this for herself, Clara said, but she left it for anyone who needed it, for anyone willing to learn, for anyone brave enough to try something that looks backwards because the traditional way isn't working anymore. She closed the journal gently. So here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to teach you everything Ingrid taught me, the physics, the principles, the specific techniques that make this work. And then you're going to go home and try it yourselves. And when people tell you it won't work, when they say your design is crazy or backwards or impossible. She gestured at the greenhouse around them, at the tomatoes ripening in January, at 3 years of winter harvest that had fed hundreds of people and proven Ingrid right over and over again. You're going to remember this moment. You're going to remember that impossible is just a word people use when they're too comfortable with failure to try for success. And you're going to grow anyway. The workshop lasted 6 hours. Clara walked them through everything. Thermal mass calculations, optimal roof angles for different latitudes, soil preparation, crop selection, moisture management, all of it. She showed them Ingrid's original design and the modifications she made based on 3 years of experience. She answered every question, demonstrated every technique, shared every bit of knowledge she had accumulated. And at the end, she gave each person the same thing Ingrid had given her: seeds, a copy of the basic design principles, and a challenge: build it, try it, prove it works in your own conditions, then teach someone else. As people were leaving, Bill Garrett pulled Clara aside. His eyes were wet behind his glasses. 5 years ago, I thought my life was over, he said. My wife was gone. The ranch was more work than I could handle alone. I couldn't see a reason to keep going except stubbornness. He gestured at his own greenhouse, visible through the window, where tomato plants grew in raised beds he had built with his own hands. You gave me something to care about, something to wake up for. My kids don't think I'm just a sad old man waiting to die anymore. They see me learning, growing, building something. He gripped Clara's hand hard. Thank you for honoring Ingrid's work, for sharing it, for showing me that frozen things can thaw. After everyone left, Clara sat alone in the greenhouse with frost and a cup of tea gone cold. The sun was setting, painting the snow outside in shades of pink and gold. Inside, the temperature was 64 degrees and holding steady. She pulled out her own journal. 3 years of entries now. documenting everything from temperature fluctuations to personal revelations. She had started it as a record of the greenhouse. It had become a record of her own thawing. January 15th, 3 years after the letter arrived. 20 people came to learn today. I taught them everything Ingrid taught me. Watched them take notes with the same careful attention I brought to this place when I was desperate for something to care about that didn't hurt. Bill Garrett thanked me for giving him purpose. But I'm the one who should be grateful. He saw what Ingrid built and was willing to admit he'd been wrong. That takes courage. The same kind of courage it took Ingrid to keep building when everyone said she was crazy. The same courage it took me to keep living when grief said it wasn't worth the effort. Clara looked around the greenhouse, at the stone walls that held warmth, at the inverted roof that caught and kept heat, at the beds full of green growing things that shouldn't exist, but did because someone had understood that working with nature was more effective than fighting it. She thought about the person she had been 4 years ago, numb, lost, going through motions without meaning, unable to cry or hope or imagine a future that felt like anything except an endless continuation of grief. That person was gone, not erased. Clara still carried Daniel's loss, still felt the empty space where their shared future should have been. But the grief had changed shape, become something she could carry rather than something that carried her. She had been frozen, the kind of frozen that went all the way through, that made you forget what warm felt like, that convinced you the cold was all there was or ever would be. And then Ingrid's letter had arrived, and with it, an invitation to try something different, to learn something new, to build warmth instead of just enduring cold. The greenhouse had saved her, not by solving her grief. Some things couldn't be solved, but by giving her something to do with her hands and her mind and her days that felt like it mattered, by connecting her to a lineage of stubborn women who chose difficult over easy because easy would cost them themselves, by proving that growth was possible even in conditions designed to kill everything. Frost stirred, his gray muzzle resting on her knee. He was old now. They both were in the ways that mattered, marked by loss and time and the slow accumulation of scars that came from surviving hard things. But they were here, alive, growing. Clara scratched behind his ears and looked out at the valley, turning purple in the twilight. Somewhere out there, Bill Garrett was tending his own greenhouse, growing tomatoes for a wife who would never taste them. Dr. Chun was analyzing data that would help feed communities across the Arctic. Kristen Halvorsen was teaching Norwegian farmers techniques her American aunt had perfected in isolation. And dozens of other people, hundreds maybe, were building their own versions of Ingrid's upside-down greenhouse, proving in their own backyards and homesteads that what everyone dismissed as backwards was actually the only way forward. The knowledge was spreading, multiplying, growing in the same way the plants in these beds grew, slowly, steadily, converting light and soil and water into something that sustained life. Ingrid had built alone, had documented alone, had died alone, probably believing her work would be lost or forgotten. But she had been wrong about that last part. Her work lived. In Clara, in Bill, in everyone who had learned to see stone walls and inverted roofs not as crazy ideas, but as brilliant solutions to problems everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. Her work lived in every tomato that ripened in January, every leaf of lettuce harvested in February, every seed planted with the understanding that impossible was just difficult waiting for someone brave enough to try. Clara stood, her knees protesting slightly. She was 42 now, not young anymore, but not old either. Frost stood with her, patient and loyal as he had been through everything. Together, they walked through the greenhouse one last time before locking up the night. Clara checked temperatures, adjusted vents, made notes about which plants needed attention tomorrow. The same routine Ingrid had performed for 32 years. The same routine Clara would perform for as long as she was able. And someday, when she was too old or too tired to continue, she would pass it to someone else, someone who needed it, someone who was frozen and looking for warmth, someone who understood that survival wasn't enough. You had to have something worth surviving for. She would leave them the journals, Ingrid's and her own. She would leave them the greenhouse and the seeds and the principles that made it all work. And she would trust the way Ingrid had trusted that the right person would come along and carry it forward, that the knowledge wouldn't die, that the work would continue, that somewhere always, someone would be growing tomatoes in January and proving that the impossible was just the difficult wearing a disguise. Clara locked the greenhouse door and stood for a moment in the cold, looking up at stars that blazed in the clear winter sky. The same stars Ingrid had watched, the same stars that would shine long after Clara was gone. But while she was here, she would keep growing, keep teaching, keep proving that what looks backwards might actually be the only way forward. Keep building warmth in a world that seemed designed to freeze you all the way through. Keep living, not just surviving, living with purpose, with meaning, with tomatoes in January and hope in conditions that should have killed everything. Frost pressed against her leg. Clara scratched his ears one more time, then headed for her truck. Tomorrow she would harvest kale, would answer emails from people in Alaska and Minnesota and Norway who wanted to know about roof angles and thermal mass, would work on her own journal, documenting 3 years of growth, both the greenhouses and her own. Tomorrow she would keep building, keep growing, keep carrying forward what Ingrid had started, and what would, if Clara did her job right, continue long after she was gone. But tonight, she would go home to her too-quiet house that felt a little less empty than it used to. She would make dinner and sit by the wood stove with frost at her feet. She would look through seed catalogs and plan next season's plantings. And she would be grateful for Ingrid's stubbornness, for the valley skepticism that had forced Ingrid to document everything so thoroughly, for the letter that arrived exactly when Clara needed it, for the greenhouse that taught her how to be warm again, for proof that frozen things could thaw, for the knowledge that impossible was just a word, for tomatoes in January, for purpose, for life. 7 years after the letter arrived, Clara stood in front of a conference room at Montana State University and felt like an imposter. The room was full of people who belonged there. Agricultural engineers with PhDs, extension agents with decades of experience, farmers who worked thousands of acres and employed dozens of people, real experts with real credentials talking about real solutions to food security in cold climates. And then there was Clara, a widow with a high school diploma and a greenhouse she had inherited by accident, a woman who had stumbled into knowledge rather than earning it through any official channel. Dr. Chin caught her eye from the front row and smiled encouragingly. She was the one who had insisted Clara present, who had argued that lived experience was its own form of expertise, that 7 years of daily observation and continuous refinement had given Clara insights that no academic study could replicate. But standing here now, with 100 sets of eyes waiting for her to speak, Clara felt the old doubt creeping back. Who was she to teach people who actually knew what they were doing? Then she thought of Ingrid, who had built alone, who had documented alone, who had been dismissed for 32 years by people who were certain she was wrong. Ingrid hadn't had credentials either. She'd had results. Clara cleared her throat and began. My name is Clara Mendsen. 7 years ago, I was a widow living alone in a house that felt like a museum dedicated to a life I didn't have anymore. I spent my days going through motions. I spent my nights wondering why I was still here when the person I built my life around was gone. She clicked to the first slide, a photograph of herself from 8 years ago, taken at a holiday party she barely remembered attending. Her eyes in that photo looked empty, a woman physically present but fundamentally absent. This is what grief looks like when it freezes you all the way through. The room was silent. Clara could feel their attention shift from polite professional interest to something more personal, more human. Then I got a letter about a greenhouse, an upside-down greenhouse that everyone in my valley had mocked for 3 decades, built by a great aunt I never met, left to me with one instruction: learn it, use it, pass it on. She clicked through slides showing the greenhouse, the inverted roof, the stone walls, the impossible tomatoes growing in January, Montana. For 7 years, I've been living in Ingrid Halvorson's legacy, learning from her journals, applying her principles, teaching anyone willing to listen. And in those 7 years, I've learned something that has nothing to do with thermal mass or solar gain or any of the technical details that make the greenhouse work. Clara paused, looking out at the faces watching her. I've learned that the biggest barrier to innovation isn't technical. It's social. It's the certainty that if something looks different, it must be wrong. It's the comfort of dismissing ideas that come from unexpected sources. It's the ease of saying that's impossible instead of asking, why does it work? She told him about the valley's reaction, the mockery, the casual certainty that Ingrid was either lying or delusional, the 3 decades of documented success that everyone dismissed because they couldn't reconcile the evidence with their assumptions. She told him about Bill Garrett, who spent 30 years convinced Ingrid was crazy and then apologized to a dead woman when he finally understood she'd been brilliant. About the feed store owner who'd rather believe grocery store tomatoes were homegrown than admit an upside-down greenhouse was producing in December. About the quiet revolution of inverted roof greenhouses spreading across the valley once people were finally willing to look at results instead of appearances. The technical innovation here isn't new, Clara said. Thermal mass has been understood for millennia. The Norwegians were building earth-sheltered structures centuries ago. What Ingrid did was apply old knowledge to new context and document it so thoroughly that even skeptics couldn't dismiss it forever. She clicked to a map showing greenhouse locations. Red dots scattered across Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, blue dots spreading into Canada, Alaska, Scandinavia. Over 200 structures now, all built using Ingrid's core principles. But the real innovation, the thing that made the spread, was the documentation. Ingrid wrote everything down: daily temperatures, crop yields, modifications she tried, and whether they worked. 32 years of meticulous records that proved she wasn't lucky or delusional. She was right. Clara pulled out Ingrid's journal. The actual journal, worn now from 7 years of being handled in workshops and classrooms. She held it up so everyone could see. This journal saved my life. Not metaphorically. Literally. I was frozen in grief, going through motions without meaning. And this, she gestured at the greenhouse photos behind her, this gave me something to care about, something to learn, something to build that felt like it mattered beyond just getting through another day. Her voice caught slightly. She steadied it. Ingrid built a greenhouse, but what she really built was a demonstration that different doesn't mean wrong, that the answer everyone dismisses might be the only answer that works, that knowledge from unlikely sources, old women, widows, people without credentials, might be exactly what we need. She looked directly at Dr. Chun. You asked me to speak today because you said my experience matters. That 7 years of daily observation taught me things academic studies miss. But I think you invited me for a different reason. Clara set the journal on the podium. You invited me because I'm proof that knowledge transfer works. That someone with no agricultural training, no engineering background, nothing except grief and stubbornness, could learn a complex system and teach it to others successfully. I'm proof that Ingrid's documentation was good enough to bridge 32 years and turn a complete novice into someone competent enough to stand in front of actual experts. She smiled slightly, or at least someone brave enough to try. The room laughed softly. The tension broke. Clara relaxed into the rest of her presentation, walking them through technical details and practical applications, answering questions about R values and convection currents and optimal crops for different climate zones. But the part that mattered, the part people came up to talk about afterward, was the beginning, the story of a frozen woman finding warmth, of knowledge preserved across decades, of results that eventually, inevitably, proved louder than skepticism. A young woman approached as Clara was packing up, mid-20s, wearing work clothes that had seen actual work, dirt under her fingernails, the kind of hands that planted seeds rather than just writing reports about them. I'm Emma, she said. I'm trying to start a food cooperative on marginal land in northern Saskatchewan. Everyone says it won't work. Winter's too long, growing season too short. Can't compete with industrial agriculture. She pulled out a notebook that looked like Bill Garrett's had looked 7 years ago. Worn, well-used, ready to be filled with knowledge. Will you teach me? Clara felt something settle in her chest. The feeling she got every time someone asked that question. Every time knowledge moved forward, instead of dying with the person who learned it. Yes, she said. But first, let me tell you about a Norwegian woman who built an upside-down greenhouse in 1952 and spent 32 years proving everyone wrong. That summer, Clara did something she'd been thinking about for years. She started a formal apprenticeship program, not a workshop, not a one-day teaching session. A real apprenticeship, 3 people at a time, living on property for 3 months, working the greenhouses dawn to dusk, learning through their hands and backs, and the daily repetition that turned information into knowledge into wisdom. Emma from Saskatchewan was the first. She arrived in June with a duffel bag and a head full of enthusiasm that Clara remembered feeling 7 years ago. That electric hope that came from believing you'd found the answer. The second was Marcus, a Blackfeet elder from the reservation, who wanted to bring the design to his community. He moved slowly, spoke carefully, and watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. He'd been farming for 50 years and wasn't too proud to learn something new. The third was Amy, a recent college graduate with a degree in environmental science and student debt that crushed her. She'd taken a job at a tech company, lasted 6 months, and quit when she realized she was dying inside fluorescent lights and recycled air. She wanted to grow things, to build things, to make something that mattered. Clara taught them everything, not just the technical details, but the why behind them. Not just what Ingrid had done, but how she had thought. The patience required to observe instead of assume. The humility needed to accept that your first guess was probably wrong. The stubbornness necessary to keep trying when everyone said you were wasting your time. They worked together through the long summer days, planting fall crops, maintaining the thermal mass, repairing small damages from winter wind, testing modifications Clara had been thinking about but hadn't tried yet because solo experimentation was lonely and shared experimentation was better. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch with tea and tired muscles and talk about what they'd learned, what worked, what didn't, what they wanted to try next. It's different than I expected, Emma admitted one night in July. I thought it would be more, I don't know, magical? Like there was some secret that made it all work. There is a secret, Marcus said. He was whittling a piece of pine, his knife moving with the precision of long practice. The secret is there's no secret, just attention, just patience, just willingness to learn from what's actually happening instead of what you think should be happening. Amy nodded. My professors talk about sustainable agriculture like it was this complicated puzzle that needed technological solutions. But this, she gestured at the greenhouses, this is just people paying attention to how things actually work. Clara smiled. This was the moment she waited for with every apprentice, when they stopped looking for the trick and started seeing the truth. That complexity often hid simple principles. That innovation didn't require invention, just application of old knowledge to new context. Ingrid was right about that, Clara said. She said people wanted her to have some secret Norwegian technique or ancient family recipe for the mortar mixture, but it was just sand and cement and paying attention to how water moved. The only secret was giving a damn about the results more than about looking smart. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the Sapphire Mountains. Frost was sprawled at Clara's feet, ancient now, sleeping more than waking, but still here, still her companion in all things. What happens after the 3 months? Emma asked, do we just go back? Try to build our own versions and hope we remember everything? Clara had been thinking about that question for weeks. You go back, she said slowly. You build. You experiment. You succeed and fail and learn. But you don't do it alone. You stay connected. You share what you learn. And when you're ready, when you've made your own mistakes and figured out your own modifications, you teach someone else. She pulled out her journal. 7 years of entries now. Soon she'd need to start a new volume. Ingrid left me her journal. I'm leaving mine to whoever needs it next. But I'm also leaving something else. A network. A community of people who value results over tradition, who are willing to look foolish trying new things, who understand that knowledge works best when it flows. She looked at the 3 of them. Different ages, different backgrounds, different reasons for being here. but united by curiosity and willingness and the bone-deep understanding that the way things had always been done wasn't the only way things could be done. You're not just learning how to build a greenhouse. You're learning how to be the kind of person who builds greenhouses when everyone says it won't work. That's the real skill Ingrid was teaching, and it's the one I'm trying to pass on. In September, Clara got a call from Bill Garrett's son. Bill had died, quietly in his sleep, in the house where he'd lived for 78 years. His greenhouse was still producing tomatoes, the heirloom varieties his wife had loved, growing in beds he'd built with his own hands after spending 30 years thinking Ingrid Halvorsen was crazy. The funeral was small. Valley people didn't make much fuss about death. It was expected, accepted, part of the natural cycle. But Clara went and stood in the back of the church and listened to Bill's son talk about how his father had changed in his final years, how he'd found purpose after everyone thought he was just waiting to die, how he'd learned that frozen things could thaw. Afterward, Bill's son pressed an envelope into Clara's hands. "Dad wanted you to have this. He wrote it last month, said to give it to you when the time came." Clara waited until she was back in her truck to open it. The handwriting was shaky but determined. Bill's voice clear despite the trembling hand. "Dear Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Good. I'm tired, and my wife has been waiting 78 years for me to catch up. Woman had no patience. I wanted to thank you properly, not for teaching me about greenhouses, though I'm grateful for that, but for showing me that being wrong isn't the end of the world, that admitting mistakes doesn't make you small, that there's grace in saying I was wrong and freedom in saying, teach me. I spent 30 years thinking Ingrid Halvorsen was touched in the head. I owed her an apology, but she was already gone. So instead I tried to honor her work, to learn what she knew, to grow tomatoes the way she grew them, for my wife who loved them, for myself who needed something to care about, for the valley that should have listened 30 years sooner. You carry Ingrid's legacy forward, but you also carry something else. Hope, for people like me who thought it was too late to learn anything new, for people frozen in grief or certainty or the comfortable lie that the way things are is the way things must be. Thank you for that. Thank you for being patient with an old fool who took 75 years to figure out that different doesn't mean wrong. Keep growing. Keep teaching. Keep proving that impossible is just difficult wearing a disguise. Your friend, Bill. Clara folded the letter carefully and sat with it pressed against her chest while frost whined softly from the passenger seat. She wasn't crying. She'd learned to cry again these past 7 years, but this didn't feel like a crying moment. It felt like a closing moment, an ending that was also somehow a continuation. Bill had learned, had grown, had spent his final years building and teaching, and proving that transformation was possible even at 75, even after decades of certainty, even when everyone expected you to just fossilize in your assumptions and wait for death. That was Ingrid's real legacy, not the greenhouse design, not the thermal mass calculations. The proof that change was possible, that frozen things could thaw, that it was never too late to admit you've been wrong and start learning how to be right. Clara started the truck and drove to the greenhouse. Emma, Marcus, and Amy were working the beds, preparing for fall planting. They looked up as she approached, sensing something in her posture. Bill Garrett died, Clara said. He was one of the first people who learned from Ingrid's design. One of the first who was brave enough to admit he'd been wrong. She showed them the letter. Let them pass it around and read it. Let them understand that the work they were doing mattered beyond technique and temperature logs. This is what we're really teaching, Clara said. Not how to build a greenhouse. How to be the kind of person who can admit they were wrong. Who can learn from unlikely sources. Who can change their mind when evidence demands it. She looked at the three of them. That's harder than stacking stones. Harder than calculating thermal mass. But it's the skill that actually matters. Emma nodded slowly. My professors couldn't do it. They were so invested in their own expertise that they couldn't see solutions that came from outside academia. I watched brilliant people dismiss practical knowledge because it didn't come with the right credentials. My community as elders who know things universities never studied. Marcus added. And universities have researchers who dismiss traditional knowledge because it wasn't peer-reviewed. Both sides certain they're right. Both sides missing what the other has to teach. I quit my job because I couldn't admit I'd made a mistake, Amy said quietly. Spent 6 months miserable because saying this isn't working felt like failure. Like if I just tried harder, I could make it right. She gestured at the greenhouses. This taught me that sometimes the answer is to try something completely different. That changing direction isn't failure. It's adaptation. Clara smiled. Ingrid would like all of you. She valued people who could learn over people who already knew everything. They worked together through the afternoon, preparing beds and checking systems and talking about the modifications they wanted to try. The greenhouse was never finished, never perfect. It was a living system that required constant attention and adjustment and willingness to experiment, just like the people who tended it. That night, Clara updated her journal one last time before the apprentices left. September 28th. 7 years since this started. Bill Garrett died. He was 78 and spent his last 5 years growing tomatoes for a dead woman because he needed something to care about beyond his own ending. Emma, Marcus, and Amy leave tomorrow. They'll go back to Saskatchewan and the reservation, and wherever Amy decides to build, they'll try what I taught them. They'll succeed and fail, and learn and eventually teach others. The network grows. The knowledge spreads. Ingrid's design is reproducing across the north like seeds catching wind. But more than the design, the attitude is spreading. The willingness to question assumptions. The courage to try things that look backwards. The humility to learn from unlikely sources. That's the real legacy. Not stone walls and inverted roofs. The understanding that innovation often looks wrong before it looks right. That the people everyone dismisses might be the ones with answers. That different deserves examination before it deserves mockery. I'm 49 now. Not young. Not old. Somewhere in the middle of a life I didn't expect to have 7 years ago. Daniel has been gone 11 years. The grief hasn't disappeared. It never will. But it's changed shape. Become something I carry rather than something that carries me. Something that made me who I am rather than something that destroyed who I was. I still miss him. I always will. But I'm grateful, too, for the life I built after he died, for the knowledge I found when I stopped hiding in an empty house, for the community that grew from one woman's stubbornness and another woman's grief. Ingrid built in isolation. I built in community. Maybe that's the real evolution here. Maybe the next generation will build a network so extensive that innovation spreads faster than skepticism can kill it. Maybe someday, the upside-down greenhouse won't be remarkable. It'll just be one option among many. The way people grow food in cold climates. No longer crazy or backwards, just practical. But until then, we keep teaching, keep proving, keep growing tomatoes in January and showing people that impossible is just difficult waiting for someone brave enough to try. Clara closed the journal and looked out at the greenhouses, their glass panels catching starlight. Frost was asleep at her feet, his breathing slow and even. The thermometer on the wall read 58 degrees inside, 26 outside, same as it ever was. Same as Ingrid had documented for 32 years. Same as Clara had proven for 7. Tomorrow the apprentices would leave. Tomorrow Clara would start preparing for winter alone again. Tomorrow the work would continue in the same steady rhythm it had followed for nearly 4 decades. But tonight, she sat in the warmth of stones and glass and felt something that had taken 7 years to find. Peace, not happiness. That was too simple a word for what she felt. Not contentment. She was still learning, still questioning, still pushing boundaries. But peace, the deep settledness that came from knowing your life mattered beyond yourself, that your work would continue after you were gone. That knowledge passed down was knowledge multiplied. That frozen things could thaw. That different and mean wrong. That it was never too late to learn. That impossible was just difficult waiting for someone brave enough to try. Clara stood, her knees protesting slightly. Frost rose with her, ancient and loyal to the end. Together they walked through the greenhouse one last time before heading home. The tomatoes were ripening. The lettuce was growing. The stones were warm. And somewhere out there, in Saskatchewan and the reservation, and wherever Amy ended up, 3 more people were learning to build warmth in a world that seemed designed to freeze you through. Learning from a woman, who learned from a woman, who learned from the land itself. Learning that the valley could mock all it wanted. The harvest would speak for itself. 10 years after the letter arrived, Clara woke to find Frost had died in his sleep. He lay in his bed by the wood stove, curled in the same position he'd taken every night for 14 years. Peaceful, still, gone in the quiet way old dogs go when they've lived full lives and their bodies finally decide enough is enough. Clara sat beside him for a long time, her hand on his gray fur, remembering the day Daniel brought him home as a puppy, the 3 years they'd been a family, the 7 years after when Frost had been the only warmth in a frozen house, the moment at the greenhouse when he'd pressed against her leg and she'd understood, for the first time since the funeral, that she wasn't completely alone. She buried him on the hill above the greenhouse, where he could watch over the valley he'd roamed and the structures he'd helped build just by being present, by offering warmth when everything else was cold, by staying when staying was the hardest thing. "Thank you," she whispered to the fresh earth, "for everything." The apprentices that season, 3 new ones, always 3, helped her plant wildflowers over the grave. They didn't ask questions, didn't offer platitudes, just dug and planted and stood with her in the kind of silence that honors loss without trying to fix it. That night, alone in her house for the first time in 14 years, Clara understood something she'd been avoiding for months. She was tired, not the temporary exhaustion that came from physical work, the deep weariness that lived in bones and meant something was ending. She was 52, not old by modern standards, but old enough to feel the weight of 10 years spent teaching and building and carrying forward a legacy that had never been meant to rest on one person's shoulders alone. Ingrid had worked until 94, but Ingrid had worked alone, at her own pace, for her own reasons. Clara had turned her solitary practice into a teaching center, her private knowledge into public resource, had spent a decade saying yes to everyone who asked to learn, yes to workshops and apprenticeships and conference presentations, and emails from strangers in distant places who needed guidance. She had built something remarkable, but building was exhausting, and she was tired. In November, Clara called a meeting, not an apprentice session or a workshop, a gathering of everyone who had learned from Ingrid's design and gone on to teach others. Emma came from Saskatchewan, where a cooperative was feeding 40 families year-round. Marcus drove down from the reservation with 2 younger tribal members who wanted to expand their community greenhouse system. Amy arrived from Alaska, where she'd built 3 structures serving remote villages. Dr. Chin came. Bill Garrett's son came, bringing his own children who'd grown up eating tomatoes their grandfather grew. People Clara had taught 7, 8, 9 years ago. People she'd never met, but who'd learned from people she'd taught. Second-generation knowledge keepers. Third-generation adapters. 53 people filled the largest greenhouse, more than the space was designed for, but they made it work, stood shoulder to shoulder with the kind of comfortable crowding that came from shared purpose. Clara stood at the front, her hands shaking slightly, not from nervousness, from the weight of what she was about to do. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I ask you here because I need to tell you something, and because I need to ask you something." She paused, gathering words that felt too heavy to speak. "I'm tired. I've spent 10 years teaching anyone who wanted to learn, running apprenticeships, managing workshops, answering emails at midnight from people I'll never meet. It's been the most meaningful decade of my life, but I can't do it anymore. Not at this pace. Not alone." The room was completely silent. "I'm not dying," Clara added quickly, seeing concern flash across faces. "I'm just done. Done being the center. Done being the person everyone comes to. Done trying to hold all of this." She gestured at the gathered crowd. "In my head and my hands in my house that was never meant to be a teaching center." Emma stepped forward. "What do you need?" Clara felt her eyes burn. The question was perfect. Not what's wrong, not are you okay, but what do you need? The question teachers asked when they learned that fixing wasn't the answer. Supporting was. I need this to be bigger than me, Clara said. I need it to be a network instead of a center. I need everyone here to stop seeing me as the keeper of the knowledge and start seeing yourselves that way. Because you are. You've all modified the design, adapted it, learned things I never knew. You're not my students anymore. You're colleagues, peers, teachers in your own right. She pulled out a document she'd spent 6 weeks preparing, a formal structure, a nonprofit organization, the Halvorsen Institute for Cold Climate Agriculture. I'm not the director, Clara said. I'm one board member among 7. Emma, Marcus, Amy, Dr. Chun, you're 4 others. We need 2 more. People who've built successfully. People who can teach. People willing to share responsibility. Bill Garrett's son raised his hand. I'll do it. For my father. For Ingrid. For everyone who was wrong and learned better. A woman Clara had taught 4 years ago, Susan, who ran a community garden in Whitehorse, stood. I'll do it. If you'll have me. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not relief exactly. Release. The understanding that what she'd built could survive without her at the center, that it was supposed to survive without her. Then it's done, she said. The Institute is real. The network is official. And I'm just one voice among many. Dr. Chin stood. We need to acknowledge something. Clara didn't just teach us technique. She taught us how to be teachers. How to honor knowledge from unlikely sources. How to admit when we're wrong. How to value results over credentials. She looked around the greenhouse. That's the real skill here. Not building structures. Building community around shared learning. Clara demonstrated that for 10 years. Now we carry it forward. Not because she's gone, she's not, but because that's how knowledge survives. By multiplying. By spreading. By becoming bigger than any single keeper. The room erupted in applause. Not the polite kind. The real kind. Born from gratitude and recognition, and the understanding that something important had just shifted. Clara let the sound wash over her, let herself feel seen, valued, and finally, released from the burden of being the only one who held everything together. That winter was the quietest Clara had experienced in 10 years. She took no apprentices, led no workshops, answered emails only when she felt like it, which was rarely. Instead, she worked the greenhouse alone, the way Ingrid had, the way Clara had during that first winter, when grief was fresh and purpose was new. She planted and harvested and observed and documented, not for anyone else, for herself. She wrote in her journal every evening, not data this time, reflection, what the 10 years had taught her, what she learned about teaching and community and the difference between being needed and being useful. December 15th. First winter in a decade, without anyone asking me for anything. Strange how heavy absence can feel when you've grown accustomed to constant wait, but also liberating. I'm remembering why I fell in love with this work. Not the teaching, the growing, the daily observation, the quiet conversation between gardener and plant that gets lost when you're trying to explain it to someone else. Emma sent photos from Saskatchewan. Their greenhouse cluster is producing enough food to supply 100 families now. Marcus reports the reservation system is expanding to 3 more communities. Amy's Alaska structures survived -40 without supplemental heat. The network is working. Better than I imagined. They're not waiting for me to approve their experiments. They're just trying things, sharing results, learning from each other. This is what Ingrid wanted. Not one person holding knowledge. Everyone discovering it together, building on what came before, while adding what comes next. In February, Clara received a package from Norway. Inside was a photograph of a young woman standing in front of an inverted greenhouse, holding a baby. On the back, in English, 4th generation, growing food that shouldn't grow. Thank you for keeping Aunt Ingrid's work alive. Kristen's daughter, Marie, 4th generation. From Ingrid to Clara to the network to children not yet born when Clara first found the greenhouse. The knowledge was reproducing, multiplying, becoming something larger than any single person's work. Clara pinned the photograph on her wall, beside one of Ingrid from 1952, standing in front of her original greenhouse with the same expression of stubborn satisfaction. Two women, 70 years apart, united by the understanding that impossible was negotiable. Spring came slowly. It always did in Montana. But Clara noticed it more this year. Had time to watch the incremental changes. The way snow retreated up the mountainsides. The first brave green pushing through dead grass. The birds returning from wherever they spent winter, and wondering why anyone would leave this valley even when it was frozen solid. She was in the greenhouse in late April, transplanting seedlings, when she heard a truck coming up the drive. Unusual. Most people email before visiting now, respecting the boundaries Clara had finally learned to set. But when the truck parked and the driver got out, Clara understood why they hadn't called ahead. The woman was maybe 30, short, compact, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd survived something that left scars. She stood at the greenhouse door for a long moment before knocking. Clara wiped her hands and opened the door. "I'm Sarah," the woman said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I lost my daughter 6 months ago. Car accident. She was 4. Her eyes were dry but haunted in a way Clara recognized immediately. I can't keep doing nothing. I can't keep going through motions. I need something to care about that doesn't hurt so much I can't breathe." Clara felt time fold. Saw herself 10 years ago, standing in almost the same spot, needing exactly the same thing. "Come in," she said. She gave Sarah the same tour she'd given herself that first day. Showed her the stone walls and the inverted roof and the impossible tomatoes that proved different wasn't wrong. She told her about Ingrid and 32 years of documentation, about how the greenhouse had saved Clara's life by giving her something to do with her hands when her heart was too broken to function. Sarah listened, touched the warm stones, knelt in the beds where green things grew, and finally, sitting on the floor with her back against thermal mass, she cried. The kind of crying that came from somewhere deeper than tears. Grief that had been frozen solid, finally starting to thaw. Clara sat beside her, didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes, just sat in the warmth of stones and glass and knowledge passed down, and let another frozen woman begin the slow work of remembering what warmth felt like. When Sarah could speak again, she said, "Will you teach me?" Clara looked at this young woman whose grief was fresh and raw and freezing her from the inside out. Looked at the greenhouse that had thawed Clara's own frozen places. Looked at 10 years of teaching and a lifetime of learning that survival required purpose, and purpose required something worth caring about. "Yes," Clara said, "but I'm not taking formal apprentices anymore. The Institute runs those programs now. What I can offer you is something different, something Ingrid gave me. One-on-one knowledge transfer, just you and me and the work, for as long as you need it." Sarah's eyes filled again. "Why?" "Because 10 years ago, I stood where you're standing, and a woman I never met left me the tools to thaw. I can't bring your daughter back. I can't make the grief disappear. But I can teach you how to grow things in impossible conditions, how to build warmth when everything's frozen, how to find purpose in the daily work of keeping things alive." Clara stood, offered her hand. "It won't fix anything, but it helps. I promise you it helps." Sarah took the offered hand and stood. Together, they walked to the beds where spring seedlings were pushing toward light. Clara handed Sarah a trowel and showed her where to dig. How deep, how careful. The simple, ancient work of putting seeds in soil and trusting they would grow. "This lettuce will be ready to harvest in 6 weeks, Clara said. "By then, you'll have planted 4 more crops. By fall, you'll understand why the stones matter. By winter, you'll be harvesting tomatoes in January and believing that impossible things happen every day if you know how to make conditions right." Sarah pressed her hands into the soil. "I don't know if I can believe anything right now." "You don't have to believe yet," Clara said gently. "You just have to plant. The belief comes later, when you see what grows." They worked together through the afternoon, planting, watering, learning the weight of soil and the feel of seeds, and particular satisfaction of doing something with your hands that might eventually result in life. As the sun set behind the sapphires, Clara showed Sarah to the small cabin she built 2 years ago for visiting teachers. One room, simple, warm. Stay as long as you need, Clara said. Learn what you need, and when you're ready, when you found your own warmth again, pass it forward. That's all Ingrid asked. That's all I'm asking. Sarah stood in the cabin doorway, looking back at the greenhouses where glass caught the last light of day. Thank you, she whispered, for not saying it gets better, for not trying to fix it, for just offering something to do. Clara smiled. It does get better, eventually. Different, but better. But you're right. Nobody needed to tell me that 10 years ago. I needed something to do with my hands and my days and the grief that felt like it would kill me if I held it still. She turned to leave, then paused. Ingrid wrote something in her journal. The year after her husband died. She said, grief doesn't end. It changes shape, becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. The greenhouse taught me that. How to hold weight, how to build support, how to create warmth even when everything inside you is frozen solid. Sarah nodded slowly. I'll try to learn that. You will, Clara said with certainty, because you're here, because you asked, because you're willing to put your hands in soil and trust that something might grow. That's all it takes, the willingness to try. That night, Clara sat in her house, quiet now, but no longer empty, and opened Ingrid's journal one last time. She'd read it hundreds of times, could recite passages from memory. But tonight, she was looking for something specific. She found it near the end, one of Ingrid's last entries, written when she was 93 and knew her time was running short. I built this greenhouse to survive, to have purpose when my husband was gone and the valley thought I should give up, to prove that different wasn't wrong, to demonstrate that knowledge from unlikely sources might be exactly what the world needed. But what I really built was a demonstration of transformation, a proof that frozen things thaw, that impossible becomes possible when someone cares enough to try, that grief changes shape but doesn't have to destroy you. I'm leaving this to someone who needs it. I don't know who, don't know when, but I know they'll come. Someone frozen solid, looking for warmth. Someone everyone's given up on who hasn't quite given up on themselves. When they come, and they will, I want them to know you're not broken. You're just cold, and cold is solvable. Build the stones, angle the glass, plant the seeds, do the work. The warmth will come, not all at once, slowly, like spring returning to frozen ground. But it will come. I promise you it will come. Clara closed the journal carefully. Outside, the greenhouses stood dark against starlight. Inside them, plants were growing. Stone walls were holding heat. Systems were functioning exactly as designed. And in the small cabin, a frozen woman was beginning, just beginning, the long, slow work of remembering what warmth felt like. 10 years ago, that frozen woman had been Clara. Tonight, it was Sarah. Tomorrow, it would be someone else. The work continued. The knowledge spread. The warmth multiplied. And somewhere, Ingrid Halvorsen was smiling, not because her design had been validated, though it had, not because she'd been proven right, though she had, but because the real work, the work of transformation, of thawing, of building warmth in impossible conditions, was continuing long after she was gone, carried forward by women who understood that frozen wasn't forever, that different wasn't wrong, that impossible was just difficult waiting for someone brave enough to try. Clara turned off the lights and went to bed. Tomorrow she would teach Sarah about thermal mass, about solar gain, about all the technical details that made the greenhouse work. But tonight, she'd given her something more important. Hope, the kind that came from putting your hands in soil, the kind that grew slowly, like spring returning to frozen ground, the kind that proved, day after day, harvest after harvest, that warmth was possible even when you thought you'd frozen all the way through. The town had mocked the upside-down greenhouse, until winter harvest silenced them all, until frozen women learned to thaw, until impossible became just another Tuesday.